We have a real treat this afternoon. Our speaker is danah Boyd. So about 2 days before the scandal broke involving Congressman Weiner, my daughter, who's 15, told me that she had opened up a Twitter account. And I said, "You absolutely cannot tweet. You cannot do it." And she yelled and screamed and cried. And I thought, is this what danah Boyd would have done? Danah has been called the high priestess of internet friendship. The high priestess of internet friendship. And she makes being really, really smart look like a lot of fun. In fact, when you first meet her, you might be surprised to know this lady's amazing credentials. She has her bachelor's degree from Boston University, her master's degree from MIT, and a PhD from the University of California at Berkeley. She's currently a senior researcher at Microsoft Research. She's been a research associate at Harvard's Berkman Center for Internet and Society. And there she was engaged in a project which was funded by the MacArthur Foundation on internet safety, and I think it was called the Internet Safety Technical Task Force. She has written a lot of articles and co-authored a book, Hanging Out, Messing Around, and Geeking Out, Kids Living and Learning with New Media. She's become a kind of go-to person when you want to try to understand, especially from a youth perspective, what it means to. Her views are subtle, they're provocative, they're interesting, and they're very, very smart, again. Once I had the pleasure of sitting next to danah at a conference banquet, conference dinner, and I realized people all around the table were scowling at me because I was monopolizing her. I wanted her to tell me everything she knew and to give me all of her insights on how to deal with teenagers in the internet age, of which I have two. But today I'm not going to monopolize her. She's all yours, danah.
Good afternoon. So today I want to talk to you about some of my research on young people and their use of social media. And I want to start by saying that I spent a lot of time struggling with a very basic question that people keep coming up with, or a very basic statement that I'm sort of frustrated by. The notion that kids don't care about privacy. And I hear this all the time, and it never resonates with me because it never resonates with the stories that I hear from young people. And this here's a quote from a young woman named Bly who actually put this quote up on youth radio, and it's delightful. And she says, "You know, my mom always uses the excuse about the internet being public when she defends herself, in reference to her mother looking in at all of her content. It's not like I do anything to be ashamed of, but a girl needs her privacy." And this sort of gets to the core of one of the biggest challenges that we face when trying to understand what's happening with social media. The fact that young people are very much participating in these very public spaces, but they're doing so even when they want a sense of privacy. So, for those who don't know me, I'm an ethnographer. I spend most of my time running around the United States talking to young people about their use of technology, trying to understand basically the cultural logic behind what they do and why they do it. And so I spent a lot of time, I guess it's been about, 7 years at this point, of looking at young people as they've hopped onto all of the major social media sites. And one of the things to keep in mind is just that there is a social expectation to be a part of different kinds of social media. And I hear it in a variety of different voices from young people for a variety of different reasons. So, this is Abigail talking about how, you're expected to be on Facebook. And if you're not there, you have to have a good reason. It's not like you have to pay for it. It's pretty much expected you're on Facebook. Right, and here's one of the sort of interesting components about this, which is that young people have this expectation that they're to participate in these very public environments. So what are they doing and why are they going there? They go to these spaces to hang out, to joke around, to flirt, to socialize, to really be with their friends. So conceptually, one of the most important things to realize is that what these spaces have become is a new form of public life. Right? And we can argue about what it means for these to be privatized publics, but they are publics nonetheless, and for many young people, they're the only publics to which they have meaningful access to, due to all sorts of restrictions in their lives. So how do you actually understand what these network publics are? And what are the things, for those who are sort of Habermasian scholars, you might recognize this sort of framing. For those who are queer studies scholars, you might realize that I'm sort of pushing back against things. But really what network publics are publics that are restructured by network technologies They're simultaneously a space constructed through the network technologies and the collections of people that come together. And the reason why this sort of move is really important is to realize that network publics aren't quite the same as other forms of publics, the publics that we know and are comfortable with. They're very much sort of different in a set of different properties, and we'll get into that. But the thing that's also really important to realize is that just because teens want to participate in a public doesn't mean that they want to be public. And we use those terms, and those two gets collided very easily. It's important to acknowledge that their participation in a public is not the same as they're trying to be public. And young people recognize that the spaces that they're navigating in some ways look different than the spaces of their parents. It's one of the things they struggle with. Here's a beautiful quote from Alicia where she's sort of highlighting that, "I just think that technology is redefining what's acceptable for people to put out about themselves. I've grown up with technology, so I don't know how it was before this boom of social networking. But it just seems that instead of spending all of our time talking to individual people and sharing things that would seem private, we spend all of our time putting it up in one module of communication where people can go and access it if they want to." Right? And this is something that you can see the sort of twists of what these publics are about. Instead of deciding what to share, part of it is putting things up so that people can access it. And the reason that this is important is that what network publics do is reshape how we actually navigate what is public and private in really phenomenally important ways. So if you and I were having a conversation out in the hallway, we'd be talking back and forth and we'd be interacting, and our conversation would be private by default. Not because it has to be private, but because it takes effort to make it public. Now you might decide that you want to share whatever I've said with a whole variety of people, and you go through a process of publicizing what I said. And you may play a Linda trick and try to record everything that I say, but that would be really socially awkward and a weird violation of the social norms. Because by default, when we're face-to-face with one another, we assume that our interactions are private. Online, everything shifts. The default interaction is public by default, private through effort. Public doesn't mean all people across all space and time. It means all the people for which I care about. And one of the things that you see with young people is that their articulation of who they are friends with on social network sites is in many ways their articulation of who they conceptually think of as part of their public. And they're building their sense of public in order to engage and to have a conversation with that public, and then to go out of their way to make things private. And that's important because young people do care about intimacy. They do care about finding ways to sort of pull back and find a way to actually have more private encounters. But they're much more conscious of the decision to make things private than they are to make things public. Now, of course, this creates all sorts of challenges. First off, what on earth are those kids doing, which is a classic refrain that I hear from parents. But what are the norms? What are the boundaries? And what you see is that young people actually have a really strong conceptual model of who they think that are part of their world. They're thinking in terms of boundaries. So, one of the things you'll hear is that, when young people like Chantal say, why are teachers on my page? I wouldn't go to a teacher's page and look at their stuff. So why should they look at mine? Right? This expectation that people should understand what the social norms are and that the social norms should operate as a reasonable boundary. And unfortunately, this tends to never work, especially for young people when they're faced with real structures of power, because they're constantly struggling with people who hold power, hold authority over them. And so you have this sort of tension, right, which is that young people believe that Facebook and these social media sites are for their friends and not for their parents. It's important to note that they don't even imagine corporations or the government as part of the audience, even as somebody that they want to resist. They're really conscious about resisting the people who they actually see and who they imagine in their power world. So they imagine teachers, they imagine law enforcement if that's part of their world, they imagine military recruiters, they imagine college admissions officers, but they do not imagine governments and corporations. So this becomes a really important thing for us to tease out is when we think about privacy, is who's doing the looking, how are they doing the looking, why are they doing the looking, and what does it mean in relation to young people? Because what young people really want is they want a sense of having social privacy, a sense of understanding that they can have boundaries that are really important to them. So how does this actually play out? One of the challenges, with young people is that they'll talk a lot about sort of these things where sort of problems emerge. And I love Carmen. She's adorable, and she'll come up a couple times later on this talk. And she talks about how she really loves her mother, and her mother is extremely important to her. So of course she wants her mother to be on Facebook. But the problem with it is that her mother has a tendency to overreact to everything, and she comments on everything. And from Connie's perspective, she wants her mother to sort of look in and be respectful of the space, but she doesn't want her to talk. Because the moment that she talks, everyone kind of disappears, right? And it becomes a real challenge for Carmen about how to navigate this. All right, so if we have this sort of general sense of what young people are doing or why they're trying to think about it, how do they actually achieve this? What are the strategies that they take? And the strategies are doing a really good job of highlighting the degree to which they deeply care about privacy. Because the strategies show that even when they have no control over a situation, they're trying to develop a sense of strategies there. So the other thing that's really important to realize about privacy is that there are two key components to teen privacy that come through in all of these strategies. First, privacy is the ability to have control over a social situation. It's not about control over information. It's not control over who can actually get access to something. It's about control over the social situation, being able to really dictate the social norms and make sense of it. The second key component about privacy that we often forget is that it's about agency. And agency is the ability to assert control over a social situation. And agency is one of the things that you will hear that young people sort of struggle with all the time. So let me talk about the sort of first key way that they try to cope, and it's often one of the biggest challenges, is they try to assert social norms. They try to sit there and say, this is what it should be. Hunter was one of the teens that I spent a lot of time with, and he's delightfully adorable. If you want to sort of picture Hunter at his best, and I couldn't find a great picture to represent him, because of course this is not his real name nor his real picture. But Hunter basically is a Steve Urkel of the modern day, complete with the broken glasses. He's a young, geeky boy living in Washington, D.C., who is from a family. His parents, his mother is the only one living in the States. She's undocumented. And he's going to a charter school, which is very sort of geeky, and he's really excited about it. But he's dealing with these two very distinct worlds. On one hand, he has his mother's world, his cousin's world, the world in which he sort of lives in at home. And on the other hand, he has his school and their social norms. So one of the things for Hunter is he's constantly trying to assert that social norms should be the strict boundary, the way of sort of separating things out. But he often fails at this, right? And he highlights this when he says, when I'm talking to my friends on Facebook or I put up a status, something I hate is when people who I'm not addressing in my statuses comment on my statuses. In my old school, people always used to call me nerdy and that I was the least black person they've ever met. Some people say that, and I said on Facebook, should I take offense to the fact that somebody put the ringtone white and nerdy is for me? And it was a joke. And I guess we were all talking about it from school, and my sister comes out of nowhere, and she's like, "Aw, baby bro." And I'm like, "No, don't say that. I wasn't talking to you." Right? He says, "How do you know what, or said, how do you know when people are, who's being talked to with Facebook status updates?" He said, "I guess that's the point. Sometimes it's probably hard, but I think it's just a certain way you talk. I will talk to my sister in a different way than I talk to my friends at school." Right, and what he's highlighting is that he's trying to signal to the different people who are part of his audience what the social norms are. He's trying to set it up. In some ways, this is not that far different from the keep out signs that we've seen in physical spaces. This is a way of trying to make a signal. But Hunter highlights that this fails. This fails abysmally for him every time. And what I see from young people is that whenever they go back to social norms as a regulatory boundary, it fails and they get frustrated. Because people think that they have the right to look. And in particular, parents are the biggest abusers of this, although it tends to come in all forms. People think that they should look in just because they can. So in other words, just because you have access doesn't mean you're actually wanted, but young people struggle to actually do this. So